Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at Disrupt CX 2020. Sadly, this event has had to be cancelled because of coronavirus, but I like the fact that we've shown some adaptability and improvisation, and this event is now happening online. If you like, there's been disruption to Disrupt CX 2020, but we found a way through it. Well, look, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. My name's Matthew Syed, author and columnist for the Times and the Sunday Times. I'm going to speak for about half an hour, mainly about the psychology of high performance. What are the psychological and cultural factors that drive high performance in a complex world? And I'd like to start with this branch of modern psychological research where different cohorts of people have been given a questionnaire to probe the way they think about success. How do they conceptualize success? Simplifying a little, this questionnaire effectively asks, where does high performance come from? That question is asked in a number of different ways to check for consistency of answer, to make the questionnaire difficult to game. And this has been given to software engineers, to medics, to aviators, to footballers, and many other groups. And broadly speaking, in answer to this question, you get two categories of answer. Over here, in what's sometimes called the fixed mindset, people say, well, to be good at my job or some dimension of skill within the job, it's about the thing we often think about when it comes to high performance: talent, predisposition, the right kind of aptitude, the right kind of brain, the right kind of genetic inheritance in order to excel. And if you want to have a successful team or organization, you need to hire people of this ilk. And I think perhaps most of us would agree this isn't completely false. Talent is a real phenomenon that explains some of the variation we see in performance in most areas of human activity. And if you can identify talent, it makes sense to hire for it. But over here, in what's sometimes called the growth mindset, people say, whilst talent isn't irrelevant, it is a factor, in a complex world, it isn't enough. In their focus too on these other ingredients that drive high performance, like disciplined practice, like constant self-evaluation, reaching out to diverse voices, and a recognition that however good I am, even if I'm a bit of a genius, I can nevertheless get better at what I do. This turns out to be, in my submission to you, of great psychological significance because it enables people to do something that can be challenging, for some people almost threatening, namely learning from errors, from mistakes, from failures, and to use a slightly inelegant term, from suboptimality in all of its various guises. Now, this distinction between fixed and growth isn't quite as binary as I've made it sound. This is a continuum. But what makes this psychological research quite exciting is, depending on where people sit on this spectrum, in what's effectively their answer to one question, you can measure the behavior. And according to controlled trials, the behavior turns out to be significantly different. And one of my pitches to you today is that understanding the power of a growth mindset culture has massive implications for how organizations grow and how they win. And perhaps one good example to flesh out how these mindsets manifest themselves in organizational and other settings is to think about the recent history of Microsoft. Big company, it's had 3 chief executives in its 40-plus year history. Bill Gates, of course, the founder, Steve Ballmer, and more recently, since 2014, Satya Nadella. Now, since Nadella took over, the market capitalization, the equity value of Microsoft, has gone up by almost $1 trillion. Pretty impressive. And I've got to know Nadella a little personally, because I think in journalistic terms it's interesting to deconstruct how these transformations happen. And he said it's very simple. When I became CEO at Microsoft, my number one priority was to change the culture from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. He said Microsoft had had a lot of historic success and we got complacent. He said we became an organization of know-it-alls. Everyone wanted to look like the smartest person in the room. Now, what's the last thing you want to hear about if you want to look smart? Well, it's going to be the errors and the mistakes and the deficiencies in the product line. You're not going to want to hear about what competitors are doing better, because instead of seeing that as an opportunity to learn the lessons and pivot to something better still, you see that as a threat to your self-image as the smartest person out there. You don't want to hear what other industries are doing to solve the same problems for the same underlying psychological reason. When you have a critical mass of managers and leaders in a fixed mindset, it can suppress the bottom-up flow of creativity and innovation that is so important for staying ahead of the competition. And of course, even though Microsoft is a huge company, the competition in that sector is very fierce, with machine learning and AI and quantum computing and neural networks. Nadella said we need to switch from an organization of know-it-alls to an organization of learn-it-alls. Now, the language may sound a bit naff, but you can see when you're a learn-it-all, you want to know where the deficiencies are. You want to know where the suboptimality resides. If somebody says to you, we can get better at this, the implication is you're not perfect. That's threatening to people in a fixed mindset. In a growth mindset, this is an opportunity, not a threat. And Nadella's argument is that the change at Microsoft was not really a change in the level of talent, but a change in the psychological environment in which people were operating, enabling them to collaborate more effectively, to innovate meaningfully and effectively to grow. Now, I want to transition into a related topic, which is that of cognitive diversity, intimately related to the growth mindset, but I think worth fleshing out in a slightly different way. Now, the way we typically think about diversity in the world today is in what you might call demographic terms, differences in race and gender and social class and religious background. I want to focus more on cognitive diversity, the differences in the way people think and the perspectives and insights and models and heuristics that they use to make sense of the world. I think it's perhaps fair to say that there is a very strong overlap in many contexts between demographic diversity and cognitive diversity, because our identities influence the way we think about the world, the experiences we've had, the way we filter what we see. So if, for example, you were putting together a team to come up with an advertising campaign to connect with a broad demographic of people, it is not inconceivable that if your team was made up exclusively of white, male, middle class, middle-aged, private school educated Oxbridge graduates, they may miss opportunities to connect that campaign with consumers, some of whom will have lives very different from their own. I hope that is a claim that doesn't need a lot of fleshing out. And you can see how that would be problematic in a number of different contexts. But I want to suggest that there are some other contexts where the overlap between demographic diversity and cognitive diversity is less significant. But if, on the other hand, you were putting together, say, a team to design an aircraft engine, the fact that I am mixed race, I'm, for what it's worth, half Pakistani, half Welsh, this is quite an unusual combination, but the fact that I'm mixed race and I grew up with the experience of being mixed race isn't necessarily going to give me any germane insights into how changing the design of that engine, tweaking it, is going to improve its aerodynamism. So I want to suggest one of my pitches to you is that we mustn't reduce diversity to a box-ticking exercise. I think it can have a lot more power, and it certainly has a lot more subtlety than that. So the question is how to flesh out what true cognitive diversity looks like and how it can be optimized. And I want to use perhaps a couple of examples. One of them comes from the study by Jack Soll, who is a psychologist at Duke University. He took economic forecasters from around the world and he measured their forecasting track record. And not entirely surprising, some were more accurate than others, and the distribution was effectively a bell-shaped curve. I think the most accurate forecaster, a woman at Goldman Sachs, was about 5% more accurate than an average forecaster, so not terribly surprising. But then he took the top 6 forecasters, put them in what you might call a nominal team, and looked at their collective judgment, effectively the average of their forecasts. And he compared the accuracy of the average of the top 6 with the accuracy of the top forecaster. Now, in a very simple linear environment like running in a straight line, if you take the time of the fastest runner in the Olympic final, let's call that person Usain Bolt, and you compare his time with the average time of the top 6 runners, what is going to be faster, Usain Bolt or the average of the top 6? Well, self-evidently, unless it's a dead heat, Bolt is going to be faster. But when Sol took the top economic forecaster and compared their accuracy with the average of the top 6, this is a complex environment, remember, making an economic forecast, lots of different variables. The result was reversed. The average of the top 6 was more accurate, but not 1% more accurate, or 5% more accurate, or 10% more accurate, 15% more accurate. This is a staggeringly large effect, and not all economists are aware of it. The question is, why the effect? And the reason is because of cognitive diversity. Each economist brings a particular model to make sense of economic phenomena. Each of these models, because they're professional economists, contain some useful information. When you combine the information in 6 models, you must have more information than in any one model, even the most accurate model. If you're thinking each of these models also contains errors and blind spots and biases, that is true. But without wanting to get overly technical, the technique of averaging leads to the errors filtering out. Some people are a bit higher than the eventual turnout for GDP or the oil price. Some are a bit lower. They tend to cancel. So effectively, you're pooling the information and filtering the error. This is a robust finding in social science, sometimes called the wisdom of the crowd. Now, it's worth saying that there are other complex tasks where you don't necessarily want to take averages. So if you're problem solving, if you take one proposed solution and another and you try and average them, you can often get incoherence. This is sometimes articulated in the expression, a camel is a horse designed by committee. But nevertheless, even with problem solving, having diverse groups leads to wiser, more innovative solutions, because diverse people nudge each other towards better solutions. And this has been found in field literature and in lab experiments. But let me take another example, which is coming up with creative ideas. Creative idea generation, so important in the modern world. And we can see again a really extraordinary and counterintuitive power of cognitive diversity. So if you imagine you're putting a team together to come up with great ideas for the future 5 years of your strategy, and let's also assume that you're a good talent spotter and each of these people comes up with 10 genuinely useful ideas. How many genuinely useful ideas do you have in total? So you've got 10 people, each one of whom has come up with 10 genuinely useful ideas. And if you're anything like me, you might think, well, that's 100, 10 times 10. But if these people are cognitively homogeneous and come up with the same ideas as one another, you might only have 10. If they're cognitively diverse, on the other hand, then yes, you could have 100. Now, this I think is quite significant because you have teams comprised of individuals of equal talent. They're all coming up with 10 useful ideas, but one of the teams is almost 1,000% more creative. If your HR function only looks at the talent of individuals, they won't understand this extraordinary contrast. It's only by taking a step back and looking at the meaningful differences between people that you identify where creativity can come from in a group setting, which is where most creativity emerges today. So cognitive diversity can make a massive, huge, world-changing difference. But here's the deep irony. We're attracted to people who think just like us. It makes us feel smarter when people are telling us things we already know. It validates our assumptions and our worldview. The pleasure centers of our brains light up when people are effectively mirroring our perspective. So you have this profound unconscious tendency in organizations and beyond where people who are like-minded, who think in similar ways, gravitate towards each other. And in those circumstances, you have what I think is a pervasive phenomenon in the world today, but groups of people comprised of highly intelligent individuals, but who are also collectively, well, stupid. And it's worth taking a tiny bit of time just to figure out just how stupid these groups can be. If you have in a simple environment, like running in a straight line, if you take the fastest runner in the world and you cloned that runner, let's again say that that's Usain Bolt, and you put 4 of them in a relay team and your objective is to win the race, that's a pretty good team. Every member of your team is faster than any member of any other team. You're likely to smash the competition with a couple of assumptions. They pass the baton effectively and so on. But if you were to take and clone the most accurate economic forecaster in the world and put 4 or 6 or 8 of those in a team, is that a good team or a bad team? Every member of your team is more accurate than any member of any other team. But it turns out this is a terrible team. They think in exactly the same way. They're adding nothing to each other. They're making the same error. In fact, we know from the Jack Soll experiment that a diverse team of forecasters would be 15% more accurate. In a complex world, I want to suggest that the success of organizations is not just about the talent and insight of the individuals within it. It is also fundamentally about their collective diversity. And one quite interesting story from history, I think, perhaps can bring this to life. You all know about Bletchley Park, the group that cracked the Enigma code during the Second World War. Massively important breakthrough. Some historians think that it changed the outcome of the war. The consensus is that it at least shortened the Second World War by 2 to 3 years. And if you were hiring great code breakers, if you're anything like me, I guess you're thinking great mathematicians, number crunchers. And they did hire some really good mathematicians, world-class mathematicians, historic mathematicians like Alan Turing and others. But on January the 12th, 1942, the Daily Telegraph organised a crossword competition. A reader had written to the editor saying the crosswords have got too easy and they can solve them in under 10 minutes. The editor, for what it's worth, was slightly sceptical about this, didn't think it was possible to solve the crossword in less than 10 minutes under controlled conditions. But he said if anyone thinks they can, the newspaper will make a £100 donation to charity, which was a lot of money back then. So on January the 12th, 30 crossword enthusiasts congregated on Fleet Street, the newsroom floor, to take part in this competition. One of whom was a guy called Stanley Sedgwick, who was a lowly bank clerk, worked in the city, learned to play the Telegraph crossword on his daily commute. And he did very well on the day, just over 10 minutes, but nevertheless hugely impressive. But what Sedgwick didn't know, and what the editor of the Daily Telegraph didn't know, nor any of the other competitors, is that one of the observers on that day was from the British Secret Security Service. And a week or so later, Sedgwick got a letter in the post saying we'd like to see you on a matter of supreme national urgency. Sedgwick was slightly surprised when he got the letter, because what Bletchley Park had preeminently in my submission to you, they were early adopters of cognitive diversity. They knew that a team of Alan Turings would have been individually brilliant, but collectively utterly unable to crack this code, a complex, multi-dimensional task. And that's why they expanded the diversity. They had philosophers and cultural historians and linguists. More than half the people working at Bletchley Park were women. That turned out to be of massive significance. And I'll come back to that. Stanley Sedgwick also brought critical insights that could so easily have been overlooked, because it turns out that cracking codes and solving crosswords share an important pattern. Now, you may not know this, but crossword enthusiasts turn out to be very good quasi-mind readers, because each national newspaper has 5 or 6 crossword setters, and the crossword enthusiasts can get into the mind of the crossword setter. They can identify the crossword setter with the first one or two clues and efficiently anticipate what is coming and therefore get to the end of the problem quickly. This is very important in code breaking because the people inputting into the Enigma machine are supposed to put the letters in randomly every time. But under pressure, some would put the same letters in again and again, and they might put in the first three letters of a German swear word or of a girlfriend's name. Cedric was brilliant at this task, and he worked in Hut 10, which intercepted the weather enigma, very important for Bomber Command, but these also operated as cribs for the naval enigma, which was the toughest enigma to crack, 2 independent layers of encryption, but doing so proved to be fundamental to winning the Battle of the Atlantic, getting the supplies across from the United States past the U-boats. And so that's how a lowly bank clerk played a fundamental role in one of the greatest teams in human history. George Stein, the philosopher and critic, said Bletchley Park was the greatest achievement of the UK during the 20th century. So if you're at least tempted to agree with this thesis, the question is, what kind of diversity matters? How do you get a handle on it? And I want to just give one quick story from my own working life. I sit on a committee that advises Gareth Southgate and Philip Neville on football. Southgate is the men's team coach and Philip Neville the women's team coach. And I'm not saying this is a great group by any means. I think it could improve in terms of its cognitive diversity, but it's nevertheless an interesting group. Because on it there is Lucy Giles, who helps to run the Sandhurst Military Training Academy, and Dave Brailsford, who's a cycling coach, and Manoj Badali, who's a British Asian founder of high-tech startups, and Sue Campbell, who's an Olympic sport expert, and Stuart Lancaster, who's a rugby coach. And a few football journalists said this is a ridiculous group to be advising Southgate and Neville. You know, Harry Redknapp knows more about football than Dave Brailsford. Tony Pulis has forgotten more about football than Lucy Giles. Redknapp and Pulis, for those who are unaware of, are veteran football managers. And that is true. They do know more about football. But here's the thing. Southgate already knows what they know. They were socialised into the basic assumptions of English football, a way of setting up tactically, a way of recovering, and so on. If they had got together, they would have just been agreeing all the time, potentially becoming more and more confident about gravely flawed assumptions. What's been interesting about being in this meeting is the real magic happens when somebody says something not known to the others in the room. You're getting the cross-pollination of ideas, divergent thought, like when Brailsford talks about how big data sets in cycling can help to personalise diet with big implications, how Lucy Giles talking about psychological preparation of soldiers for combat and how that might improve the way England players prepare for a penalty shootout and other things of that kind. That, I think, is where true collective intelligence comes from. But imagine if Brailsford and me and Lucy Giles and others were advising not on football, but about designing a hadron collider. You'd have lots of diversity of thought, but it wouldn't be relevant. So I want to suggest that optimizing true cognitive diversity, you need to have insights that are relevant to the problem. You sometimes need deep domain experts, but that are nevertheless diverse and different and create synergy. And there are tools and techniques that can help organizations to do just that. And it's worth mentioning, perhaps, that there are many organizations where senior leadership teams, they look diverse. And yet they've been at the organisation so long that they think in exactly the same way. They've got identikit patterns of thought. They reach for the same metaphors and historical examples to reason through problems. That can be exceedingly dangerous. And if we might sort of go back to the question of innovation, it's quite interesting, I think, that if you look at the patterns of where innovation comes from, cognitive diversity is absolutely front and centre. So you can see this in a number of different ways, but let me just take two. If you look at science, 100 years ago, many of the hit papers were written by individual scientists working in a particular silo of knowledge. They were drilling ever deeper into their particular area of expertise. Today, hit science is characterized by a very different pattern. Patterns that are sometimes called atypical subject combinations. You've got people from different branches of science working together, like, for example, psychologists working with economists or anthropologists with historians. This again is creating the cross-pollination of ideas, and it can have extraordinary power in making sense of the world, because the world doesn't obey the categories we impose upon it. There is, if you like, a kind of a unity of knowledge, and when you get people from different fields whose ideas confuse together, you can get a much more comprehensive understanding of the phenomena. The same, incidentally, to bring it more into the practical world, is happening in the patent catalogue. Again, 100 years ago, most of the successful patents were characterized by a single code. But now most of the patents that are really successful have multiple codes. They're recombining ideas in fresh and different ways. So most digital technology is recombining existing technologies in new ways to create new solutions and new products, new prototypes, and other things of that kind. Perhaps a way to really make this rather more tangible is think about two very familiar technologies. Human beings have had luggage for many millennia, animal skins to carry things around. We've also had wheels for a very long time, and wheels have been refined and developed, and luggage has been refined and developed, but along two separate tracks. It took until about 1972 to bring them together. Now, I remember this because when I was young, I used to carry my very heavy bag around transit. Now, you just wheel it along. But it's fascinating that it required somebody to act as a bridge between these two technologies in order to solve a problem that had actually been around for quite a long time. Well, we've covered two topics, but clearly related: growth mindset and cognitive diversity. I suppose it goes without saying that leaders, in particular in a growth mindset, are much more likely to be able to tolerate different opinions, different voices as they seek to make good decisions. And this is extremely important, because even if you have diverse voices in the room, they can shut down if people are afraid that those ideas and insights might diverge from those of the leader. Instead of saying what they truly think, they can end up saying what they think the leader wants to hear. And that just isn't going to be a success in a complex, rapidly changing scenario. So my pitch to you is, if you can get the synthesis of a growth mindset culture that truly values cognitive diversity, that is a game changer. We often think of culture as something that's a bit soft and ephemeral and a bit fluffy. I want to suggest it is the cutting edge factor that drives high performance. And leaders or anyone else in an organization sparing a bit of bandwidth to think about that issue can make a huge difference. Thank you very much.